Plenty of people out there thought that the Moto X actually kind of missed the mark by not having super high-end specifications. Well, now that the Moto X is officially out, we can compare it to those top-tier devices. Hey, it's Joshua Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And this is the Moto X versus the Samsung Galaxy S4. As should be obvious from the get-go, the Moto X's trump card in design is the Moto Maker. Not only are you able to customize the color of your phone, further cosmetic changes will come in the future. The Samsung Galaxy S4, on the other hand, comes in only a handful of colors. The Galaxy S4's main advantage comes from its 5-inch screen here, and the fact that it is one of the easiest larger screens to handle. The general aesthetic remains pretty classic Samsung, with the glossy plastic that can be slippery to the touch. It's a material choice plenty of people are admittedly getting tired of, but it is pretty tried and true for Samsung. A tactile home button is up front with the typical button layout on the sides of power, opposite, volume, rocker. The very thin back cover is removable, allowing access to the battery and SD card slot for expandable memory. It might be a little bit harder to manipulate it than the Moto X, but the hand gymnastics on the S4 are kept to the minimum. I will say this about the Moto X, I really missed being able to reach the top opposite corner with one hand. The X does come with a smaller 4.7-inch screen that affords it a smaller all-around form factor. Motorola's design choice of having a very curved back did pay off, as the ergonomics of this device are very high. There are no tactile buttons up front, and the button layout is all on the right side. And instead of a glossy plastic, the X employs a soft touch plastic that isn't nearly as slippery or prone to fingerprints. It might be somewhat thicker at the peak of the curve around the back, but then again, the curve is supposed to help alleviate all of that. Despite its material choices, the Galaxy S4 deserves a lot of credit for having one of the easiest to handle 5-inch screens available now. Its feat of improving on the footprint of the Galaxy S3 is definitely one of its strongest suits. But then the Moto X reminds us that we have to know what we really want out of our devices. A smartphone with such easy and simple handling is something we often take for granted these days, I think. When you want to keep things simple, the Moto X is probably the most accessible smartphone currently available. But of course, it is because of the smaller screen that the Moto X has been able to achieve that. In this battle, we have the fight between 720p and 1080p resolutions. So, on the Moto X, we have a screen that plenty of spec-hungry people have already lamented. 720 resolution is what you get at 312 ppi. But don't get hasty and disregard the X because of this, because this is a great performing little AMOLED screen. For the most part, you won't be able to even tell you're looking at a lower resolution screen, unless, say, you put it right up next to a Galaxy S4 and you go searching for it. Side by side with the Galaxy S4 is a great Super AMOLED 1080p resolution screen capable of 441 ppi. The Moto X is actually able to hold its own. But the S4 screen is bigger. It better fits the current trends, and is absolutely one of the best out there. When you want a bigger overall display experience for, let's say, gaming or media consumption, the S4 screen is stellar. Having that super saturated color profile does lend itself to more vivid colors than the Moto X, but the X does take advantage of the AMOLED technology itself with its active notifications. Ultimately, it comes down to size. If your eyes are really that good at finding the quality difference, then perhaps you would go for the S4, but in their respective sizes, both of these screens absolutely achieve great results. Sure, you can look at this as last year's specs versus current specs, but that would just be hindsight at best. I have a better metaphor for it though, that I'll get into in a bit. First of all, here's the Samsung Galaxy S4 with its Snapdragon 600 processor that clocks in at 1.9 GHz, backed by the Adreno 320 and 2 GB of RAM. There's no doubt that the current crop of phones sporting this package are among the fastest and best available, and this isn't even mentioning the Snapdragon 800 that is starting to pop up. There might be the occasional bit of stutter here and there, but it doesn't hinder tasks in the slightest. Performance on the S4 has remained reliable, and its scores and benchmarks support this. You'll get good and fast performance on the S4, no problem. And that's why the Moto X was rather lamented due to its engine under the hood, but it seems Motorola knew exactly what they were doing. Yes, you get the Snapdragon S4 Pro of last year, clocked in at 1.7 GHz and backed by the Adreno 320 and 2 GB of RAM as well. However, a couple of extra cores were added in for governing specific tasks like voice recognition, and they really do lighten the Snapdragon's load. Altogether, this is called the Motorola X8 computing system, and you know what? It gets the job done. Lower scores in Antutu don't adequately show just how fast this phone can go. This is likely due to the operating system being pretty damn close to fully stock Android, but also it's probably because of these optimizations. After all, we've had over a year already to get the S4 Pro right. And therein lies my metaphor. Think about this the way you would think about cars. Perhaps an engine, or let's say a performance package from a few years ago, continuously gets tinkered with over time and eventually becomes a much more optimized version of its former self. In that way, we could be talking about the Moto X. However, we could also be early adopters of the more updated performance packages that have more power in them because obviously we're getting better every single year. And in that case, we could be talking about the Samsung Galaxy S4. Either way, you're going to get great performance from either one, so if that helps you kind of put things into a little bit more perspective, then great. Basically, this is just me saying, try not to be way too spec hungry and just disregard the Moto X just because it doesn't happen to have the latest and greatest that is out there today. When it comes to hardware, this battle can be summarized in really one word: practicality. Either you'll use the features Motorola put into the X or the myriad of extras Samsung put into the S4. In the case of the Moto X, Motorola and Google wanted to enhance your Google Now experience. Voice recognition is always on due to those 2 extra cores, and when you say, "Okay Google Now," it comes up right away for any and all commands. It's incredibly handy, and coupled with the active notifications, they are really quite practical, especially if you're already a Google Now user. In other specs, the X comes with a non-expandable 16 or 32 gigabytes of onboard storage, along with the usual bevy of connectivity tools. The S4, on the other hand, sports expandable memory on top of its 16, 32, or 64 gigabytes of onboard storage. It is in all the other extra sensors, though, that Samsung wanted to keep their focus. My full review of the S4 will give you the rundown of all of these extras, so check it out if you haven't already. But a few worthy of mention are motion sensors, barometers or thermometers for measuring your surroundings and S-health, and an IR blaster. There are a lot of new ways of navigating your phone, and it's clear that the S4 wanted to be more than just your smartphone. The Moto X, on the other hand, seems to just want to perfect your smartphone experience. So it's quality over quantity here, but it's up to you which one of those 2 words accurately depicts either one of these phones' capabilities. We do have to award the Galaxy S4 a little bit of an edge here in terms of battery, solely because it sports a replaceable one. Having a spare 2600 mAh unit handy is always helpful, but that being said, the Moto X with its 2200 mAh battery is able to get the full day's job done. Battery saving features on both devices perform well, and the way the Moto takes advantage of the AMOLED screen helps keep things pretty steadily powered. By the end of a long day, I consistently had at least 20% battery life available by bedtime on either device, so it comes down to that spare, but you'll get a pretty standard level of longevity in either phone. The camera situation does favor Samsung's pedigree just a little bit more. After all, the Galaxy S line has pretty consistently brought great optics to the smartphone market. The Galaxy S4 app comes with all of the new features that again are explained in my full review, but include drama and eraser modes along with dual recording. The 13 megapixel picture quality is where the S4's strengths are, as the color reproduction makes nearly any picture have a high level of vibrancy. There is little doubt that the Galaxy S4 sits atop the camera phone market. Which is why, for what is supposed to be a flagship device, the Moto X does disappoint with its camera offerings. You get 10 megapixels in a much simpler app. As this is almost stock Android we're working with, the interface uses touch and swipe navigation and comes with only a few extras like HDR and slow motion video. You are able to easily access the camera app by flicking the phone about, so quickly getting to your shot is more than possible. The quality suffers a bit as the colors end up quite muted compared to their real-life counterparts. I will say that the sharpness though is really up there, as pictures have great detail and remain very crisp, so it's really a shame that the color has to suffer. For those looking for the utmost in quality, there is no doubt that the S4 takes it here as pictures are just objectively better. The Moto X camera interface is easier to use and its pictures are very sharp, though for some, that just might not be enough. Let's get right to the Moto X in this software section. As stock Android as it gets, the Moto X interface is pretty much what we Android enthusiasts pine over. Motorola's enhancements don't change the general aesthetic really at all and add quite a bit of functionality. Users of Google Now, like I've said, will likely get a real kick out of using the voice recognition service that activates it. Just say, "Okay Google Now," and you're ready to give whatever commands you want. After that, you get Google-esque home screens, notification dropdown with shade, and the general aesthetic in this 4.2.2 version. The Galaxy S4, on the other hand, employs the TouchWiz we all know and love or hate. Its more bloated and uber colorful elements make a return with Samsung's sensor enhancements for navigation. You can see in the notification shade just how much you're able to do with this 4.2.2 version of TouchWiz. Hand gestures for moving about, air view for zooming into things, and even tracking your diet and exercise are all possible. Samsung really packed in everything they possibly could, and thus it gives you a ton of options. If you feel the new ways of navigating will prove useful, the S4 is loaded with them. Otherwise, the Moto X is about as accessibly simple as it can get. For either phone, the on-contract price remains pretty much around $199. Even though that price might seem a little steep for the Moto X, this comparison should help you keep in mind how these two phones are actually closer on level than you may think. Unlocked, both hit around the $600 mark, with the S4 hitting generally above it and the Moto X slated to be closer to $550. And so, there you have it. Yes, this comparison would have been one-sided if we were dealing with just any mid-range phone, but as the Moto X is continuously proving, optimizations can go a really long way and can be just as good as updating the hardware itself. As both phones are around the same price, this is truly an exercise in knowing what it is you really want. Customization of the Moto X has brought plenty of people over to its platform, but in general it gets closer to perfecting the system we already have in place. The S4, on the other hand, adds new options to the system, and in the process might be a little too overwhelming for some. We have two great phones here either way, and as long as you're plenty confident in which experience will better suit you, then the choice that you make should end up being a good one. As always, thank you very much for watching, and if you still haven't seen the full reviews for either of these devices, then you can see links to them in the description below. Drop us a like on our videos, don't forget to subscribe, and stay tuned to Android Authority's channel for all the best news, coverage, and reviews, because we're your source for all things Android.